This is Michael Woodward, and this is episode 66 of the Jumblethink podcast.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the Jumblethink podcast, a podcast focused on telling the stories of dreamers, makers, innovators, and influencers. Along the way, we give you some tips and ideas of how you can make your own dream and big idea a reality. On today's podcast, we have Dr. Erwin Bryant. More about Eric in a moment. On Monday's episode, we have Leland Jones. He's an entrepreneur, CEO, founder, author, speaker. He started a company called T-Quotes. They create really cool t-shirts. He's also authored a book called A Journey with Purpose. What's most impressive is that Leland has done this and he's only 18 years old. It's a pretty cool story. I think it's really going to inspire you to chase your own big idea and dream. Make sure to check that out this coming Monday. I have a super exciting announcement today. For a long time, you've been able to check out the podcasts in most of your favorite places to listen to podcasts, like iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, so many other places. But you weren't able to tune in on iHeartRadio. Well, now you can. If you are an iHeartRadio fan, make sure to swing on over there and subscribe to the podcast and catch every episode there. We'll still be able to be found in all the other really cool places, but super excited to add iHeartRadio as one of the places you can find us now. Now let's jump into today's interview with Dr. Erwin Bryant. I am super excited about today's guest. Our guest is Erwin Bryant. I've known Eric for several years now through the Mosaic Alliance, which is a part of the Mosaic Church, and a really cool guy. He's a lead pastor at one of the campuses for Gateway Church in Austin, Texas. He's also an author, a professor, a podcaster, and a speaker. He wrote a book several years ago called Peppermint-Filled Pinatas. Really cool book. It came out in version 2 called Not Like Me, a field guide for influencing a diverse world. And now it's in its 10th anniversary. It's launching in the next few days, and it's retitled Not Like Me, Learning to Love, Serve, and Influence Our Divided World. It's a super important conversation for all that's going on in the world around us. So let's jump into the conversation. I am super excited about my guest today. His name's Erwin Bryant. He's a pastor, an author, a professor, a podcaster, a speaker, and just all around incredible guy. Eric, thanks for being on.
Well, thank you. That's a very kind introduction. It's great to be with you.
You know, it's been a couple years. We connected years ago through something called the Mosaic Alliance under Erwin McManus. Got to meet you years ago, but it is fun to reconnect up and hear about your journey and what you're in the process of relaunching.
Yes, it's been an exciting 7 years. It's hard to believe it's almost been 7 years since I moved from Los Angeles, and I've been in Austin. Still love my Mosaic family, but have a new Gateway family. I've discovered that churches and cities are like kids. You can love more than one at a time. And but our 7 years here in Gateway Church in Austin, has been really a lot of fun and challenging. Austin only has about 13% of its folks that attend church on a Sunday. So in many ways, it's a post-Christian context. And so with the 10th anniversary of Not Like Me coming, we've relaunched this book and made some edits and updates. But it's amazing in the last 10 years, when it was originally Peppermint-Filled Pinatas, to now how much our society has changed and how much really this idea of loving people, serving people, and influencing people who are not like us is more relevant today than ever.
Yeah, so let's go through that real quick. The book has had 3 iterations. It started out as Peppermint-Filled Pinatas.
Yes.
Then it went into Not Like Me, a field guide for influencing a diverse world.
Yes.
And now in version 3, 10th anniversary, it's Not Like Me, Learning to Love, Serve, and Influence a Divided World. So progression of title there, I'm sure there's been some progression of the content itself. Before we dive into the book, let's talk a little bit about your journey, because I think that's important because it sets kind of the tone for your experience and where this book was born out of. You church planted in Seattle. You, of course, worked at Mosaic, which is Erwin McManus' church out of LA. And now you're in Austin at Gateway. It's been a journey. Tell us a little bit about how you got into ministry and that progression to where you are today?
Yeah. Well, at the age of 17, I was at a camp, and I remember specifically the speaker, Dawson McAllister, shared a passage, Luke 10:2. The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And for some reason, well, I think it was the Spirit of God, all of a sudden, a 17-year-old kid like myself was listening as if that was a message from God directly to me. I had never really considered that as an option. I don't really have pastors in the family. I was thinking of business or medicine. And this idea of serving other people and helping them spiritually find faith and grow in their faith really just captured me. I just felt called by God. And my parents thought maybe, this was another one of my teenage ideas that would come and go. And so even as I went off to college, they insisted I keep a degree or get a degree in business, which I'm really grateful for, because in the end, that's helped me quite a bit. Because right after college, we were invited to help plant a church. And during my last couple of years in college, I was a youth pastor of an older Baptist church that was in a transitional neighborhood. And that created within me, and even growing up in the Bible Belt, there was kind of this holy discontent with the way the church was. It was kind of a club. Everybody was a Christian in Dallas, where I grew up. There was, but there was kind of you live one way on Monday versus how you act on Sunday. And so there's just this disequilibrium. And I met so many amazing college students who had a genuine faith. It just really compelled me towards something different. So all along, while I was working with these teens that didn't look like the rest of the church in that neighborhood here in Texas, this invitation to go help plant a church in Seattle came about. And so we were excited, offered a job, before I even graduated. But then 2 months before we were to move, and at that point, my girlfriend had become my fiance, and now we were about to be married, we got a phone call from the church planner saying, "We'd still love for you to come, but we can't pay you."
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a disappointment.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
and this was pre-internet. So moving from Texas to Seattle, a place we'd never even visited, felt like a world away. But we really sensed God's calling, and so we went. And it was an amazing experience, a challenging experience. We basically saw in 4 years 4 senior pastors. The first guy just went through a really tough time and had to step down, and then his brother-in-law was the second one, and then I became a co-pastor at the age of 24, which was way too soon. And we did see some amazing things happen, but we also discovered how not to plant a church.
Yeah.
And so started volunteering at Mosaic just to have what we hoped would be a healthy experience with a church that was really reaching people who were not welcome at the church. And that was really kind of the hopes even for our church plant in Seattle, which went on. The fourth guy was there for another 10 years, and they finally ended up selling the church building we were meeting in to Mars Hill, which no longer exists either.
Yeah.
But
they've had an interesting journey.
Yeah, exactly. But it just goes to show how hard ministry is, and even our experience, I feel like a lot of real good things happen, but that local church wasn't meant to be forever. And our experience at Mosaic, which was supposed to be 6 months of volunteering, turned into 13 years. And it went from volunteering to helping with the teenagers, to helping with the college students, to starting new campuses, to serving as a navigator, the executive pastor with Erwin there. And it was a great experience. And we did experience seeing people come to faith and sent overseas. And it was just an amazing journey. And but then really feeling a call back to Texas and Austin specifically. And I have lots of aunts and uncles and cousins that I would love to help connect in their journey of faith. And so it's funny because if you do this long enough, you will have lots of neat turns. I was in Seattle 4 years, and LA 13, and now here 7. So It's not like I've jumped from one to the other quite quickly, but each has its own unique experience, and yet each has its challenges and rewards.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, your journey from Mosaic back to Austin was an interesting progression for you of bargaining with God and Erwin basically saying, no, you need to listen to your wife and things like that. If I remember the story correctly.
Yes, you remember it quite well. It was honestly, it was my wife Deborah and I were in a bad place, really. I mean, there's at one point in about 2007, she said, I don't want to be a pastor's wife anymore, which is not something you want to hear when you're a pastor.
Yeah.
But she was kind enough and gave me grace enough to get help. And together we went to counseling, and I started to realize some of my struggles with being a workaholic and a people pleaser, and just some of these things that we get caught up in ministry. And so eventually, I reluctantly agreed to pray about whether we should stay in California or move back to Texas after years of not needing to pray, because I knew what God's will for my life was. But once my wife, daughter, and aunt and grandmother, and my mother were all praying for us to move back to Texas, which really made me mad. I don't like people praying things to happen to me I don't want to happen.
Yeah.
But I basically reluctantly agreed to pray, and on that very first morning, I was praying, God, do you want us to move back to Texas? A song came over the loudspeakers there at the gym that I was working out at, and literally the lyrics are "Come Back to Texas." It's a song by the guys who sing the Phineas and Ferb theme song.
Okay.
And that was just one of many kind of miraculous signs. And the part you're remembering, I went to Erwin and shared with him, I don't know what to do. Deborah wants us to move back. I don't want to move. What should I do? And he said, well, I would never want your ministry to get in the way of your wife's happiness.
Wow.
And I had never had that concern, and probably should have. And so for about a week, the plan was we were going to move to Austin and plant a campus of Mosaic. And then my wife changed her mind, as sometimes people are prone to do. But it felt more like one of those moments where Abraham and Isaac, maybe my wife just needed to see I was willing to make that sacrifice. And so that's what gave her the sense of staying. But in the end, a year later, a lot of the signs began to come back. But this time it was me seeing them and initiating this idea as God calling us. And in fact, he was. And it's just been so exciting to see all the amazing things that have been happening in Los Angeles and at Mosaic. We were just there this summer and celebrating along with Erwin and Kim and the rest of the family and staff, just in a fun season, and just to see in some small way that what we did for all those years was continuing even more effectively than ever. And at the same time, take what we've learned and apply it in this new context, this kind of angry, anti-Christian, post-Christian context that is Austin, and still see fruit, and be able to team with another just amazing person and leader and writer, and John Burke. It's been just such a real gift to be able to have two mentors like these two guys. So I'm really fortunate and just enjoying this part of the adventure here in Austin.
That's so cool. So let's jump into the book. It's 10 years now.
Yes.
Peppermint-filled pinatas.
Which,
I
by
cannot
the way,
say that word today. I don't know.
Well, that's one of the reasons we changed the name. Actually, there was a church. There were several churches that have used the book as a sermon series, but one in particular out of Chicago called their sermon series "Not Like Me," and they basically ended up saying, "Hey, we love this book, but we are not going to call." We're not going to call our sermon series Peppermint-Filled Pinatas in Chicago. So they ended up calling it Not Like Me, and the publisher got wind of that and thought, well, that's a great idea. So that's how version 2 came about, along with some additions of field notes from different writers and poets and authors and pastors. So really, the fact you struggle with that word is one of the reasons we changed the name.
You wrote this book about discovering diversity, really going into a place and saying, how do we facilitate relationship across a diverse community? Talk to us a little bit about the premise of the book and some of the things that you talk about. I've not read the book yet. I plan on getting the 10th anniversary and checking that out very soon when it comes out.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the premise of the book, what you talk
Yeah,
about, and how that's launched into a conversation that's much bigger.
absolutely. Well, originally, the whole idea was writing, in many ways, my story of learning to love people who look differently, believe differently, make different moral choices than I would. Again, kind of stepping out of the Bible Belt into the real world and the secular world, the post-Christian world. And in many ways, what we were trying to do is, write a book about how do we reach people the church is known to exclude. And in many ways, this message is more important now than ever because unfortunately the church is known as being hypocritical and judgmental. And really, it was written to help people who follow Jesus avoid falling into the trap that is the negative Christian stereotype.
Yeah.
And if you're like me, no one likes to be pigeonholed or described as you must believe this, or you must have voted that, or you must like this, or you must hate that. As people of faith, we need to be those who represent Jesus and follow after Jesus, and not let all that the world argues about get in the way of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a good friend who wrote a book about the command of Christ, which is all about one simple thing, which he says, here are all the things that the law says. Here's everything that we know of our tenets of faith. But today I have a new commandment that you love one another. Why is the church having such a hard problem with loving people? Why is it that we miss this in that journey?
Well, I think multiple thoughts on this, but one is we're human.
Yeah.
We are, even the best of us are still in the midst of a battle between the flesh and the spirit. And so you see this all throughout the early church. I used to love this idea we need to become like the early church. Well, if you read the New Testament, the early church was filled with all sorts of heresy, immorality, and conflict. And so it is our human nature that, first of all, makes things difficult. But I'll also say that I do think that we have I don't want to guess a percentage, but a lot of people who have a Christianity, an ethnic Christianity. I was just in Israel in the Palestinian territory, and they refer to some of the Palestinians refer to themselves as ethnic Christian.
Okay.
So I think that's probably an apt term even in America, that there are people are Christian in their religion, but not necessarily following Jesus. And so what that's done is it's created this, again, what I grew up with and still happens in certain places in our country is, well, I'm a Christian because I was born in America, and I go to church because that's where my friends go, and that's where, you get some good business deals, and that's where, there's kind of this, in the name of Christianity, so much has been done because there are people who claim to be Christians who actually aren't following Jesus. So I think at least we'll just end with those two. But I do think that there is a sense of this is hard, and even the best of us struggle to love. And two, there are some people that have taken on a form of religion that actually isn't inspired by or led by the loving Spirit of God.
Yeah. So we're in this time and season in our culture right now that has been probably the last 10 years. I've seen a massive shift. I grew up in the 80s, 90s, graduated high school in the late 90s. And diversity seemed to be something that we were starting to really see inroads to healing, whether it was race, whether it was even belief systems and everything like that. You changed the title from version 2 to version 3, a diverse world to a divided world. Why has there been such a shift? Was it just an underlying current? Was there something that we were missing, that things seem more divided now than they did 10, 15 years ago?
I think you're right. I do think that's true. And in some ways, my book is an anomaly because the people who need it aren't necessarily the ones who might pick it up. uh, because a lot of us, if we're honest, feel more comfortable with those who look like us, vote like us, make the same choices we would make. So it really is a book for people who want to experience a new level of faith, a new level of adventure, a new level of risk when it comes to following after God, because it's hard to step into this work of bringing healing between neighbors and coworkers and families and friends. It's already hard enough to get along with people who look just like you and believe just like you. When you start to add the complexities of ethnicity and morality and even spirituality, there's all sorts of challenges that come with that. At the same time, I guess I felt a real sense of just calling things out, right? The goal of kind of that second subtitle is calling us to what could be.
Yeah.
This is kind of admitting where we're at. And I think that there is a sense that we probably weren't as far along as we thought, but in other ways, if I can be overly optimistic in these troubled times, I'm hopeful that all that we're experiencing from last year and the election and even this year and what's been happening even recently in Virginia is the last, what I'm hoping is the last kind of vestige of that old life, because we have got to figure out as people of faith how to reach and disciple our neighbors, our families, our coworkers, and they are not just like us. We don't live in the 1950s anymore. And frankly, there are people who are bicultural. When I was in Los Angeles, I think I did one wedding out of the dozens of weddings with
Yeah.
a couple that were both white. They were
Wow.
all, always couples from different backgrounds. And so in many ways, the future is there will not be a majority culture. And so we're just kind of feeling the pains and the change that comes. But on the other side of that could be something better than we've ever experienced. All throughout American history, immigrants have had a tough time. My ancestors on my mother's side were German. They came over in the 1840s to Texas. That's why you have towns like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels and all of this. And they were biased against. People were prejudiced towards them. In fact, they were for the North during the Civil War because the people in the South were against the Germans. And so,
Wow.
interestingly, at least that side, ended up on the right side of history, both in the Civil War and World War I and World War II, because they were fighting for America in those wars against Germany. So there's just this really interesting challenge because we're in a society that has a history of racism and bigotry. And, we haven't even talked about, what happened to the Germans is nothing like the Native Americans or African Americans. You can see that we are reaping what was sown before us. And so we have the opportunity as people of faith in the year 2017 to create something that our forefathers dreamed of and have never quite seen. We don't want to just have separate but equal, but why not create something where it's more than just separate and equal, but we're together making a better world.
Well, and that leads me to a question that I've been pondering for the last week or two. Can we live in a society that values equality and celebrates diversity? Does one suffer if we don't, if we take equality, do we lose diversity? If we take diversity, do we lose equality?
I think that's a good question. And, goodness, I can't remember the year, but just a couple years after writing this book, I wrote an article and certainly have updated it since then. But the idea was just boiling down the message of not like me. What does it take to create a diverse community? And really, it takes those who are in charge, the majority culture, those of us who are Caucasian who have, I'm fortunate. I grew up in a family where my parents both went to college. The immigrants in my family are back in the 1800s. So there's they've kind of gotten through some of those challenging years. And so basically, for those of us who have decision-making power when it comes to leadership within the church, we need to sacrifice three things. First, we need to sacrifice our mission. And that means we need to get rid of any agenda we might have and replace it with God's agenda. If it's to love God and love people and, love our neighbor as ourselves, and we may not have gotten to chosen who our neighbor is, then our mission needs to be reaching our neighborhood. And so many churches, and you mentioned the decades you grew up in, that was the era when churches would leave the neighborhoods they were in to go further out of town to be more, surrounded by people just like them. And it's easier to reach people who look just like you. But if you are in a church that is becoming, surrounded by people who don't look like you, I see that as your opportunity to get on God's mission to be missionaries right there in that neighborhood. So not only do you need to sacrifice your mission, but sacrifice your relationships. And this is true, in any context. Christians, if we're not careful, end up wanting to hang out with each other, and we end up not hanging out with the people who God has entrusted to our care, and so we end up in this situation where we're so busy doing good things with other believers that we're actually not on mission, doing what God has called us to do.
Yeah.
And so not only do we sacrifice our mission, we sacrifice our relationships, we also sacrifice our power. And it's amazing how often, we just are unaware of decisions that we're making on behalf of people who aren't even there and not giving others a voice. And so I had this one experience. It's just a small little example, but I think it illustrates this point. There was, when I was first helping out with the college students there at Mosaic, I'd get up on stage and I'd make an announcement and I'd say, if you want to help us, connect with college kids here in Los Angeles, let us know. And so I got all these folks that came up to help me. And about, 3 or 4 months in, I looked around. My leadership group was all Caucasian.
Wow.
The students we were reaching were Latino and African American and Asian and certainly some Caucasian kids. But I just remember one day praying and thinking, well, the church is diverse. This should be easy for me. Why is it that I have only attracted other people that are just like me? And I went and sat down with a woman who's a professor, Asian American, there at UCLA. And I asked her, Clarice, I thought for sure you'd jump in and help me. And she said, well, I'd love to help. I was hoping you would ask. And I said, well, I've been asking every week on Sundays. Why didn't you come to the front? And she said, that's not how we interact in my culture.
Wow.
We don't just walk to the front and say, I've got exactly what you need. In our culture, you need to invite us in. We're never going to impose. And it was just a tiny glimpse of realizing when you're a person who's been a part of making decisions, and you haven't felt the sting of bias or oppression, it's easy for you to just say, hey, I got exactly what you need, and so to sacrifice your power means to invite others to the table, to listen, to hear their story and be a part of letting them create what that future looks like. And frankly, we need to be leaders who make decisions based on who's not yet here rather than who's been here the longest.
Okay.
And so creating the future means inviting people in that reflect who we're trying to reach. And what was neat about my time at Mosaic is the name Mosaic was who Erwin and the leadership wanted us to become.
Yeah.
It wasn't who we were. Mm-hmm. We were really bicultural, but in proclaiming the future and deciding we're going to reach our neighbors no matter what they may look like, we became more and more diverse over the years.
Yeah, that's really good. You did a video for peppermint-filled piñatas a long time ago. It's very funny. Boombox or something on your shoulder, walking up. It's really funny. But one of the lines that popped up on there, and maybe I'm putting it together, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but what I liked about it was the two words tolerance and embrace were kind of put side by side. And it seems like part of this message is that we've got to move away from a world that is tolerant and into a world that embraces each other.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really, no one wakes up in the morning saying, man, I hope today someone tolerates me. Now, when your life is in danger, you'll take tolerance.
Yeah.
But what we long for is to be embraced,
Yeah.
accepted, loved, a place to belong.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what we're feeling in our culture is that people who have had a hard time or their parents or grandparents have had a hard time are saying, you know what, this is my home and I want to feel safe where I belong. And so that's where the church can be an incredible force right in the front of what's going on to say, and we say it at Gateway in South Austin. That is the part of Austin where Keep Austin Weird originates.
Yeah.
And to be able to stand up and say, you're in a space where we do not care where you came from, what doubts you might have, how you voted. We just want you to know you are welcome here. And it is unusual. Unfortunately, people don't interact with their neighbors, their coworkers. Yeah. They do not spend time together with people naturally who are different than them. But what we focus on is who we can become in Jesus. And even those who don't believe in Jesus are intrigued by this kind of loving, come as you are community.
Yeah. So one last question before we go into the rapid fire questions. How do we as the church move past being monuments into movements that change culture and community around us?
Well, I feel like I can't help but quote Erwin. So often the church has tried to hold on to culture or keep culture from changing.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying once that, unfortunately, there was a generation that held on to the traditions, and as a result, they lost their children. And so monuments aren't moving; they're protecting and they're hiding, sheltering from the world. They're not moving. Whereas a movement doesn't necessarily go the way you expect it to go. And I remember being at Mosaic in one of my last Sundays there, and Mariah, who I think a teenager at the time, Mariah McManus, Erwin's daughter, was leading, and she had us clapping so fast. And I just thought, I can't sing and clap this fast. And then I realized, oh my goodness, I'm turning into one of these old curmudgeons. I'm going to be one of these guys when I'm in my 80s. We got to start singing Hillsong, and I just thought, oh my goodness, I do not want to impose on the next generation what helped me connect with God. I want to be a part of helping them create the future. And so to me, that's what I think is exciting is the next generation. For the most part, my hope and prayer is they've grown up in a world where they have interacted together far more than mine and certainly more than my parents, so that creating a new future together becomes what the church is known for.
Let's jump into our rapid fire questions now. What is one step someone can take to start chasing their big idea or dream?
Rapid fire. I would say first figure out what it is.
Okay.
And then once you know what it is, determine what is it that's kept you from doing it so far. It could be things that have happened to you, the trials of life, but then be honest and take a moment to assess, well, what are the things that I've done that have kept this from happening? And then move quickly to, all right, what sacrifices do I need to make this vision come true?
That's good. What's one change you'd like to see in the world?
I would love to see the church known for being a place where people can belong before they believe, where people can come as they are and experience transformation.
What do you want your legacy to be?
I want to be someone who folks say, he loved unconditionally and he was faithful as one of God's servants.
Who or what inspires you?
Well, I mentioned two of them earlier, and I'll just say to be able to serve alongside Erwin McManus and now John Burke, these guys love Jesus, are so effective at what they do, and such great mentors.
I mean, they truly are heroes of the faith and modern day, just the voice of a church that needs to be heard more of.
Yeah, I agree.
What are you currently reading, watching, or listening to?
You know, I have been enjoying this new song, at least new to me, Reckless Love by Bethel. I'm reading the book on prayer by Tim Keller. And I love this podcast called Hardcore History.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about it. Haven't checked that out. I'll have to check that out. The final question I ask every guest is, what is one dream you're still wanting to fulfill in your own life?
Well, this is an imposed dream, but I have 2 kids that are high school students, and my dream is just to see them experience a relationship with Jesus and find their calling, just as I've been so fortunate to. And they're both Christ followers, but they're also young, and so that's certainly one of my real dreams.
How can someone connect with you, whether it's to find the book or to read more of your resources?
Yeah, absolutely. If you just go to ericbryant.org, articles I've written, resources like videos. We have something called the Church Growth Summit coming up that will be free online, along with a church growth workshop, and of course, Not Like Me coming out as well, 10th anniversary in September. So yeah, that's the easiest way, ericbryant.org.
Eric, it has been a lot of fun having you on the podcast. You lead well, and I know it's impacting lives around you. I know it's impacted my life, even in our short experience years ago and my journey. So thank you for taking time out and sharing your story and giving us some words that are timely for the season we're in.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much for all you do. Keep it up.
Once again, I want to thank today's guest, Eric Bryant, for taking time out to share his story and a little bit about his journey into the world of diversity. You can find links to his website, resources, and his book in the episode notes of the Jumblethink podcast. Swing on over to jumblethink.com/podcast. Click on the episode, and you'll find the links all in the notes. On Monday, our guest is Leland Jones. He is an entrepreneur, CEO, founder, author, speaker. He wrote a book called A Journey with Purpose. He is a founder of a company called T-Quotes. He's done all of this, and he's only 18 years old. It's a super fun episode. Make sure to check it out this Monday. We have had the privilege of having incredible guests, and you may have missed some of the past episodes. Swing on over to jumblethink.com/podcast, and on the page, you can find links to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, SoundCloud, and now also on iHeartRadio. Make sure to check out past guests, and when you subscribe, you'll be notified when new episodes come out every Monday and Thursday. I want to thank you, the listener, for taking time out of your day to listen to our episodes. I hope that these episodes really encourage you along your journey. I know it means the world to me and to our guests that you would listen to what we have to say, to listen to our stories, to listen to what we've learned on our journey. And ultimately, we really want to see you chase your big idea, your dream, your destiny and purpose. Take time out to really think today. What is it that you were created to do? When you step into that destiny, when you step into that purpose, the journey isn't always easy, but it is fulfilling. So go out there, find that purpose, find that destiny, and change the world around you. It makes all the difference and can really impact communities, cities, and nations. Thanks for tuning in. We look forward to catching up with you on our next episode.
En avant, en arrière, sur les côtés. Vous êtes une autre personne. Les mères de famille, les enfants peuvent également prendre un moment revitalisant dans quelques mois. Lorsque vous aurez bien saisi la technique et que vous serez maître de votre corps, vous pourrez vous décontracter même en travaillant.